Hello and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore. It's good to be with you today. Joining me, as always, are both of my co-hosts this week. I'm very excited about that. I hope you are too, listeners. Bailey Perkins-Wright, hello. How are you?
Hi, Andy. I am great.
Good to see your smiling face. And Dr. Scott Melson, hello, sir.
What's up, man? You said joining you as always. I feel like it's been eons
Right. Yeah.
since I at least have been here. It's been very hectic. A lot of stuff going on personally, travel, some work stuff. Work has been good, busy, but very busy. So glad to be here.
Good. Yeah. It always was a miswording there. Not always, because clearly last week neither of you were here. It was just me and the League of Women Voters. Well, nonetheless, I believe our listeners are excited for you guys to be back. And gosh, so much has happened in the last few weeks. We've learned that the governor has been secretly, quietly raising money to build a new governor's mansion. He actually doesn't live in the mansion. I had to correct that with my kids because we were driving to East Side Pizza the other day, and they were like, "Is that the governor's house?" I said, "Yeah, it's where they live." And after I heard the news, I was like, "Sorry, he doesn't live there." Big correction. And then I don't know. I'm sure most of our listeners are well aware of that story, so we may not need to spend a lot of time on that. Um, it's been well litigated on the Twitter, to the extent that anything can be well litigated on Twitter, I guess. Um, but we have a lot of polling that's out, and that relates to a number of races, most notably the senatorial races, the governor's race, the state superintendent's race, and then some of the down ballot stuff. So I think we're going to spend probably the bulk of this podcast talking about the gubernatorial debate, that race, maybe some of the politics and sentiment around it, and kind of give our thoughts on, you know, if we could read the tea leaves to our insights there, and then that'll be most of it, right? Does that sound good to you guys?
That sounds good. And I think it's safe to warn our listeners, just brace yourself over the next 2 weeks because there will be a lot of resources pouring into our state, which means that your TVs and your mailboxes and your emails and your text messages are going to be dominated by a lot of campaign material. So, which is not necessarily a bad thing. That means there's more saturation to reach the voters on a number of races. But just brace yourself because it is going to be a sprint to November 8th.
That's right. And if you are someone who is registered as an independent, or if your voting history does not indicate that you're like a super voter for either party, there's a good chance you're going to get an extra dose. Like, I checked my mail just before we started recording, and it had several mailers from candidates of both parties for a bunch of races that I normally don't get any mailers from. And from talking to some of my friends who work in the political world, everyone's sending stuff to print this week. So the next 2 weeks is just going to be a deluge of recyclables coming to your mailbox.
Yeah, can we go ahead and just put the old little E next to this episode, because Bailey, you said listeners brace yourselves. I assumed that was in preparation for the next 60 minutes of kind of wherever this takes us. It's 3:15 on Friday afternoon, and for the first time in several weeks, I have a cocktail at 3:15 on Friday afternoon. So we're just gonna cut loose over here.
Scott already has his finger in the air, preparing to yell, "And another thing!"
That's right. I'll tell you what.
Should we start with the polling and then get down to the debate? How does that sound? We kind of lay the landscape out. About 2 weeks ago, the 5 largest tribes came together to make a historic endorsement for one candidate together. They endorsed Joy Hoffmeister for the race for governor. To my knowledge, they've never come together like that before, right?
That is
you even
correct.
have former tribal leaders coming out with their own personal endorsement. So there really is this unified front to support a gubernatorial candidate, which is incredibly rare.
Yeah.
And there's outward acknowledgement that with that support comes monetary support, right? So that's a big deal for the tribes to be unified on that front.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's super interesting. You're right, Bailey. They've never done this before, and that announcement led to something that I personally have never seen before. So Governor Stitt's campaign manager Donnell Harder was asked if she had any, thoughts or response about this endorsement, and she said that it's no surprise. It just shows what we already know, that Superintendent Hoffmeister is in bed with all the special interests, and unlike the governor. It's the first time I've ever heard that our state's 5 largest native nations and their, I don't know, million or so inhabitants or citizens described as a special interest group, as opposed to, Oklahomans or tribal members. It was a very I think the governor's campaign, it's kind of the state that they're in right now. They are trying very, very much. They're trying very hard to appear that they are very much in control, exactly where they want to be, nonplussed, nothing's bothering them. When I think, excuse me, I'm going to be coughing every once in a while, just so y'all know I'm on the tail end of the Rona. I made it 2.5 years and it finally got me. But I think what we're all hearing from different sources, some of the same sources, Governor Stitt's campaign is not where they want it to be right now. They're not where they thought they would be. They're not where they think they should be, and really having to scramble a little bit to try and get over the finish line. We've seen announcements recently that the Republican Governors Association, the RGA, is putting a 7-figure ad buy together in support of Governor Stitt. That's in the millions of dollars, and that's going to air in the Tulsa and Oklahoma City metro areas specifically, trying to knock down Joy Hoffmeister a little bit. It is an interesting period here in the governor's race. You mentioned polling, Andy. I wanted to say that the most recent poll that we have from, was it Amber Integrated that showed Superintendent Hoffmeister. Well, the last 3 polls have showed her up. She's been up by like 1, 3, and 9, depending on which pollster you read. Right? Is that accurate? Am I getting those numbers right? Let me pull it up.
That does sound correct. It's been neck and neck. And Scott, I guess if I scrolled back in our text thread, I sent you made a little graph today that tracked the polling for the candidates over the last 3 months.
Yeah.
And so 538 has this too. You can see a dramatic, not regression to the mean, but like a closing of that gap. And then, in a recent poll, Hoffmeister overtook Stitt, and then it came back to being just ruled neck and neck there.
Yeah. So the most recent poll is from the October 10th through the 12th. That's a send action that had Hoffmeister +7, Amber Integrated October 13th through 15th. So almost the same time frame, had Hoffmeister +1. American Viewpoint, which I had never heard of prior to this and haven't heard of since then, from September the 26th to the 28th, had Governor Stitt up by 15. I don't think that's technically an internal poll, but it was a poll that was like commissioned by the campaign, and also included a lot of language that sounded like the outcome was pretty foregone. But then prior to that, October 4 to 6, Sooner poll had Hoffmeister +4, and Bruno Political Consulting February from the mid September had Hoffmeister +1. So of the last 5 polls that we have, 4 of them show leads for Joy Hoffmeister. So that is interesting.
One, I wanted to go back to our conversation about our tribal nations. There was a comment made during the debate, but I think it's a very important one to note, that when we talk about our tribal nations, we are not talking about a monolith of people. This is not one tribe that thinks one way. There are, 39 federally recognized tribes who all have diversity, not only just in culture and belief systems, but even just like um, in the way they make decisions. So when you're thinking about ideology, there is a range, even across the political spectrum, when it comes to belief systems among tribal nations. So this is very, very telling that they're all coming together, or at least the 5 tribes particularly are coming together to make a unified front on a campaign stance, because those are things that rarely happen because there's so much diversity when it comes to viewpoints and decisions of our sovereign nations. Because this isn't a supporting a liberal or supporting a conservative. This is about where tribal nations feel like their best investment could be when it comes to sovereignty, when it comes to the McGirt decision, when it comes to working with the executive branch on things needed to make governments, because when we're talking about our tribal nations, we're not talking about a race of people. We're talking about governments in the same way we would be talking about if Oklahoma was working with France or some other country, right? So having those conversations are critical to Oklahoma's future, especially because tribal nations have I think it's a almost $16 billion economic impact to the state, right? It's critical that, and they're the largest employers in Oklahoma, right? So it's critical that the nations have working relationships with leaders, and I think that's more of the dominating force, more so than supporting somebody of a specific political party.
Yeah. No, I think the nuances of some of these conversations around this campaign are super interesting. And it's, I think for, well, most Oklahomans, they don't follow it near as closely as the 3 of us do, or many of our listeners do. And so you kind of think about what are the top level takeaways that people might hear about when they hear about this stuff. I think what we see in polling and in just kind of the broader sentiment is that people are upset with politicians, right? So like when the classic, is the state or the country headed in the right direction or the wrong direction? The wrong direction is like dominating a lot of polls, and because people are kind of fed up with, and not just the direction our state is headed or our country's headed, but they're like fed up with the people who are leading it, right? And so there's that populist sentiment, Bailey, as you said, of just like, vote these bums out. The hard is that you don't vote someone out, you vote for someone else, right? With the exception of the judicial retention ballot, but that's a whole other
I
issue.
was just about to say that's not always true.
It's not, but for the ones that people actually know about, right? You can't just vote no on Kevin Stitt. You have to vote for either Joy Hoffmeister, Natalie Bruno, Irvin Yin. Like those are your other options. Or you could choose not to vote at all. And I wonder, if some of the disgust or disdain from voters might translate to that, like almost like apathetic sentiment where they're like, you know what, I just don't like any of these people. And we saw similar sentiment in 2016 in the presidential election, where a lot of voters did not like Hillary Clinton nor Donald Trump, because they just chose to sit it out, or to, in states where they could write it in, they wrote in Mickey Mouse or, whoever, or they voted for some third party candidate, Jill Stein or whomever. And of course, in our current electoral environment, when we have 2 very dominant parties, when it comes to the ballot, a vote not for someone, or a vote for a third party candidate, or a write-in, or omission of that vote, is still a contribution to the success of one of these major candidates, most likely.
And I'm willing to bet we're going to see differences in the number of votes in each of these races.
Yeah, I do think it though it does bear mentioning though because you're right, Andy, and that's throw the bums all out is certainly a common and popular sentiment. However, um, there is a key one of many key differences between Hoffmeister and Stitt. Stitt's favorability is underwater. Hoffmeister's is not, right?
Yeah.
And so I know that there are a lot of Democrats who are casting a vote. I think a lot of Democrats are casting a vote against Kevin Stitt as much as they are casting one for Joy Hoffmeister, given that she is a self-professed moderate, given that until recently she was a Republican, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, even that being said, lots of people like Joy Hoffmeister. Lots of people don't like Kevin Stitt. And that was true even in 2018, right? Kevin Stitt and Joy Hoffmeister have been on the ballot at the same time once, not in the same race, but they were on the same ballot. She got more votes than him, like a lot more votes than him, like 75,000 more votes than him. So that means that there's like 75,000 people that voted for her that didn't vote for him for whatever reason. And that was true before he spent 4 years doing whatever the hell he's been doing, and so so all that to say, I think the other thing that we were talking about before we started recording, that's important to note. I don't know what's going to happen here in a couple of weeks. 538 still has that Kevin Stitt is the favorite to win re-election. I think that for demographic trends and historical trends and and there is every reason to assume that yes, he is still a significant favorite. But I will also say, and I think you guys would agree with me, the RGA, the National Republican Committee, like they don't throw millions of dollars into a race at the last minute based on public polling, right? They're not doing this because Amber Integrated had a poll that showed Joy Hoffmeister up by 4, right? They're not doing this because Ascend had a poll that showed her up by 7. They're doing this because the Stitt campaign and the National Republican organizations have internal polling that show he is in some trouble. And they see losing Oklahoma as the governor's race here as untenable, and also tells me that they're worried about down ballot impacts. Could this impact a Senate race that is closer than it has than most people would expect? Could this impact probably not any House races with the way that redistricting was just done, but could it impact state legislative races? Could it impact the DA's race? I mean, can you imagine if Oklahoma in 2022, in a midterm election in which Democrats control all the levers of power in Washington, if Oklahoma elected not 1 but 2 statewide Democrats, and there is a real possibility that happens.
Yeah, and to your point about down ballot or just say additional races, I think the calculus could be right that if they run the risk of there being Democratic excitement in a state like Oklahoma, such that the governor, the state superintendent, potentially even a Senate seat, a U.S. Senate seat, could win. If that's the case, then there's a whole different kind of element here that the U.S. Senate is on the line, right? And they can't afford to lose what most people would agree is a solidly red seat that they shouldn't have to worry about. And now if they do, well, it makes it more difficult for them to direct money to the battleground states, right? They've got a contentious governor's race in Michigan. They've got a contentious governor's race in Georgia. But we also see the reverse happening, right? There's a contentious governor's race in Oregon where a Republican could win in Oregon, which hasn't happened for 40 years, right? The Democrats have had a solid control there. And it's the reverse of Oklahoma. And I think that's a really interesting kind of juxtaposition of being like, what is happening here? And on some level, I think it comes back to that populist dissatisfaction with our electoral process, dissatisfaction with the current crop of candidates that exists in many states across the country. And it'll be really interesting to see how these major parties and even the minor parties respond, because in Oklahoma, this very well could be one of the elections where those third party candidates get just enough to sway the outcome of the election. I looked back through our voter history for the last several decades, right? I think I went back to 1970, and since 1970, there have been two elections that were decided by fewer than 7,000 votes. The most one was in 1970, and that was a margin of only 2,100, 2,200 votes. And then in 2002, which is when Brad Henry was elected governor, he won by a thin margin of only about 6,800 votes. But that's because Gary Richardson ran as an independent, and pulled conservative votes away from the Republican candidate Steve Largent, and so it had that quote spoiler effect. If this race really is as close this year as the polling indicates, then a candidate like Bruno or Yin or them combined, if they're able to, cumulatively get like 5% of the vote, right? Like that would have had to go to one of the two major candidates. There's going to be a lot of conversation about what was the impact of these. And more importantly, it could result in um, the winner of this election, whomever it is, Stitt or Hoffmeister, winning. It's a legitimate win. I was going to do air quotes, but they actually would win, but with less than a majority of voters, right? Like they could win with 49%
plurality.
Yeah, a plurality, which to frame it another way means that most voters didn't want them. They wanted somebody else. They just couldn't agree on who that other person was.
It's almost like ranked choice voting would be a great tool to use in a situation like that. If only there was something, if only there was an election system that could be designed so that people could list their candidates in order of preference, and somehow that would be factored in to determining the ultimate winner. Can you imagine?
For our listeners, it's just key to remember. We say this oftentimes that this is going to be a numbers game. It's going to be about who shows up. So who shows up will determine the outcome of this race. And Andy, to your point about the other candidates, the third party vote, it will all depend on who shows up to vote for them, right? Will they be the people who are frustrated with the Republican Party, right? That don't want to vote for a Democrat, because then that benefits Joy Hoffmeister. That's fewer votes that go to the current governor. We also do see trends of independent voters in this state voting for Republicans. Will that mean that benefit will help Governor Stitt, right? So it really will be a numbers game, and seeing where even those throwaway votes, where they skew, and who would typically be voting where.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. In the polling, it shows that that Stitt is retaining, I think, like 75% of Republican votes, while Hoffmeister is retaining like 94% of Democratic votes. And that does leave out there the independents and libertarians. And the difference there is that means that Hoffmeister is pulling, a 20% or so of Republican voters over to her side. And there's obviously, based on registrations, a lot more Republicans in this state. So, the truth is that Stitt could probably get 75% of Republicans and win, right? Even if Joy got 100% of the Democrats, because there's just, Republicans outnumber Democrats almost 2-1 now. And so it takes someone, well, perhaps like a former Republican running as a Democrat, to pull some of those voters over there. And there's a lot. I've seen a lot of folks on Twitter, AJ Griffin, right? A notable former state senator, friend of the pod. I think her profile picture was recently changed to say, like, I'm supporting Joy. There's a lot of folks that we see that. And I expect we'll see many, many more as we near the election. Also, one of the newspapers, the Tulsa World endorsed Joy this week, for whatever, those kind of endorsements still count. But it is interesting to see momentum shifting. And in many cases, I hate to say it, but people like a winner. There's some folks who don't choose to hitch their wagon to either side until they think that side's going to win. Then they jump on the bandwagon. And I think over the next 2 weeks, we'll see a lot of that.
We're also seeing the consequences of the levels of alienation that have happened over the past 4 years, right? So, for example, there's been the controversy with Swadley's barbecue. During the debate, we saw some stepping back from those associations and more rhetoric about accountability, right? We've already talked about the tensions over the past 4 years with relations with our tribal nations. We've seen the battles with our school districts on whether or not, keeping schools open, as what's been promoted was the decision, right? That schools wanted made, or I mean, so there's just so many levels of conflict that are coming into play that could make the governor vulnerable.
Yeah, so this is all, we probably, because I was like, we're 25 minutes in and we haven't actually started talking about the main event yet. So the polls, the spending, Bailey, what you're talking about in terms of, the scandals, kind of just the state of the race right now, this is all context for the first and what will be the only gubernatorial debate that happened in the 2022 race. This was on Wednesday night of this week, hosted by Nondoc and News 9, moderated by Trey Savage and Storm Jones, nationally televised on C-SPAN, with only a few technical glitches throughout. I'll be honest. I watched the debate in preparation for our show today. I did not watch it live because I knew I was going to watch the replay in preparation for the debate, and because my New York Yankees are in the ALDS. So, or the
Well, are
LCS.
you a Yankees fan? I thought you were a Cubs fan.
So I'm married into a Cubs family, and so when the Cubs are playing, I'll fly the W. Go Cubs, go! And enjoy the Cubbies. But if you're gonna force me to pick one baseball team, so my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, as far as we can tell, was born in about 1890. Was a huge baseball fan, and he was a baseball fan in the 1920s, in the era of like those legendary Yankees greats. And so that's right. So my grandfather was a Yankees fan. He raised my dad to be a Yankees fan, who raised me to be a Yankees fan. And while I don't follow baseball incredibly closely throughout the regular season, man, baseball in October is one of the great joys in the world. So I watched the debate today so that I could watch baseball on Wednesday night. But we've all seen it. We've all had a couple of days to digest to digest the Twitter. I have some thoughts. What do you got? What did you guys think about the debate?
I also didn't. I watched about 20 minutes of it and then decided to use the time to set up some more text banking campaigns for the next couple of weeks. I felt it was a better use of my time, and then caught up on Twitter and saw, I think, all the highlights and lowlights. First of all, I don't think that the debate is going to sway many voters. It may have swayed some, but I think that most folks anyone who's tuning in on the internet to watch a debate for the governor's race is probably someone who is very interested in local politics and already kind of has their mind made up. However, the interesting thing that happened here is that it jumped, right? It wasn't just a streaming thing, right? The governor it's pretty well known, like he refused to do it if it was going to be televised locally. And so that kind of cuts down on the audience that watched it. So most Oklahomans did not watch the debate, but the fact that some national political correspondents were covering it both live, that were watching it and tweeting about it, and then the Washington Post the very next day had some headlines about it, and they were not favorable for Governor Stitt. And I think that is an interesting leap that does not often happen to Oklahoma, like our little local races here, right?
Well, when we think about how people receive news, it often isn't just from our local news sources. They are seeing many of the national news sources wherever, your political beliefs lie. So I think there is some significance of how our governor's race, which probably even 6 months ago likely wouldn't have been a conversation across the country, is now being elevated to a national prominence. That you have folks, what do you call those folks?
Like pundits?
The pundits, bringing up in conversations. I mean, there's a video going of Howard Dean mentioning, the woman in Oklahoma running.
Right.
But so it's a really interesting time that 2 weeks before the election, it shows that there is a serious competitive race for the conversations that are taking place.
Yeah, and I think to Scott's point earlier, right, that oh man, I just lost my train of thought there. What was your point earlier, Scott? This to Scott's point earlier is that this is a race now that is not what Republicans bargained for, right? Like they did not anticipate the Oklahoma governor's race being so competitive that C-SPAN is covering it, that the New York Times and the Washington Post are writing about it in the middle of the week.
Politico.
Politico had a story about it today, right? And the headline through most of these stories is a specific data point, right? That Joy Hoffmeister during the debate said that Oklahoma has a higher crime rate than other states, one of the highest in the country, higher than New York, and the governor
in California,
right? And Governor Stitt's response was just like, it was like he got bamboozled. He was just like,
he literally laughed because he said to the people watching, do you really believe that Oklahoma has more crime than California and New York?
Right. And a fact that is easily fact checked, right? And even in that, the moderators are like, well, we'll fact check that. And indeed, boom, here comes rolling out on national media of like, the governor doesn't even know the crime rate in his own state. Basically, was like the sentiment there.
And here's, so we're kind of already getting into like the specifics, and I am curious to hear what your overarching kind of takeaway of the debate was, and then we can highlight a few things. But that particular exchange really, that highlights for me what my kind of my big takeaway was. So from start to finish, I would actually say, not watching it live the first time, or just kind of following on Twitter, and then watching it live today, I actually felt like Governor Stitt did better in the first half than I was anticipating seeing. I felt like, he I will never say that the governor was in control of his facts, but because he usually isn't. But I feel like his presence was better during the first half. To me, during the first half, he seemed more at ease, certainly, than he did in the second half when he was just getting manhandled. But the exchange about crime illustrates to me what I think maybe his single biggest problem was that Superintendent Hoffmeister stated a fact. The governor's response was to laugh at her with this condescending, shit-eating grin that he's famous for, right? That like, I mean, we all know those guys, right? He has that asshole smirk on his face all the time. And his response to her was to smirk at her, laugh at her, act like she was some hysterical, crazy ass woman. Like, can you believe this person who, like, she thinks that the crime rate is higher here than it is in New York and California? And he was completely wrong. So he made himself look like an asshole, and he would have looked like an asshole even if he was right. But he was an asshole who, it turns out, was wrong. And that's all that anyone is talking about, is that he looked like a jerk, and he looked like a jerk through the entire thing. Every response, he never had a rejoinder to her that was polite. He never had a his response to anything that Hoffmeister said was never to say, oh, well, that's interesting that you say that, or, oh, well, that's an interesting point you have, but here's why I disagree. His response to everything was to laugh and to smirk and act like she was crazy. And so, I myself, I'm not a woman. I've been married to one for 15 years. Have a lot of friends that are women. So I certainly can't speak for anyone, but my sense is there are lots and lots and lots of women who have been talked to just like that by a condescending jerk of a man who treats them like they're stupid while he is in fact wrong the entire time. And to me, if I had one takeaway from the debate, forget policy prescriptions and arguments and all that kind of stuff. To me, he came off like a jerk, specifically in his treatment of the woman who's standing on stage as his equal.
I actually don't think that his presence or appearance had as much impact because of how Joy responded in the questions, right? Joy Hoffmeister came across as a candidate who could stand her ground, who could match back and forth the energies, which I think so regardless of how those smirks or remarks or whatever happened, Joy Hoffmeister kept her composure, responded to those questions, and even in many instances put the governor on the defense, right? Which I thought was something that continued to happen during the debate. And even just, I think one thing that was clear during the debate was that there were some one-liners that left that were pretty damaging from social media. One of those I left, for example, was about his top 10 slogan, right? That was something that had been championed over the past year, that everything had been measured through, that when we're talking about where Oklahoma is and where Oklahoma should be, that's been the litmus test that the state has utilized. And it was verbalized that as a CEO and leader of, this entity that is the state government, right? You have to set aspirational goals, and we're never going to hit it. And that piece, that 5 to 10 seconds has been looped all through social media. And it's leaving many people to ask, is that just a talking point? Or do we really believe that Oklahoma can't be a state that's thriving, or can't be a place that hits that top 10 concept? So I think there were some things that, even in, laughing or whatever, that were said in response of defense that were harmful in people's trust of, well, was what you're saying something that we even really believed in, right?
Yeah,
for sure. And to be clear, because I do want to, because you make a really good point, Bailey. I definitely don't want to imply that, like, Hoffmeister didn't handle it well, or like that she was being bullied on stage, because that was not the case at all. You're absolutely right. Like she handled it just perfectly. I don't think you could ask for her to have handled it any better than she did. My point is just that, like, he looked like an asshole who was being an asshole, and I feel like that, policy aside, and he had some real problems on policy and some of his answers. I just wonder if the thing that hurts him the most in the debate, I just wonder if it's that he came off looking like such a jerk.
Sure. So I think, Scott, I agree with you that I think he came off looking a bit like a jerk. Like, it's kind of like that indignation of just like, how dare you even question me? Like, I know what's up. And he was wrong on a number of those points. I felt like Joy's responses to the questions had more substantive policy in there than his did, but I think his had more substantive talking points. Not that those are always substantive, but like, he had good talking points for his base that he's trying to reach. And so I think they both did good for who they're trying to reach.
I don't know about that, Andy, because there were times where those talking points were mentioned, but they didn't align with the answer that was given. So, for example, there were ties to bringing up being the party of Biden and being connected to the Biden agenda. But then Hoffmeister said, I do not agree with Biden on energy policy, right? And gets into conversation, or says, I'm not being tied to a political party, I'm tied to, running for Oklahomans and representing Oklahomans, right? And so that made some of those talking points feel like they weren't fitting with the conversation. So
like they
I
didn't
think there
land quite as
were,
well.
talking points thrown out with trying to connect with the base. And honestly, I don't know if I took his laughing at Joy mentioning the crime rate as trying to make her look silly, but more so of alignment with the bias that Oklahomans have,
Right.
right? And the
Yes.
ways that we demonize California and New York as these dirty, overpopulated places that have all these dangerous people, and that Oklahoma is different because its values are, conservative and, family oriented and all those things. And so it was almost an appeal to the base. Like, do you really believe that Oklahoma has bad people like California and New York? You know what I'm saying? Kind of challenging that bias and that notion. And who knows whether or not that was effective for the base to be like, yeah, like we're not California. And maybe that was a wake-up call, like with the national media and the data that's, coming down, challenging that talking point. But I really did see it as a place where he was trying to connect to that bias, because whether or not it was factual or not, there are Oklahomans who really believe that California and New York are staunchly different places and are completely different Americas.
Right. Yeah. It is like that in-group and out-group kind of dichotomy, right? Where he's trying to be like, are you with me or are you with her? And it's, are you with me, Oklahomans, or are you with her and Biden? Like that was the thing. And as I think we've said on the show before, time and time again throughout this campaign season, it has seemed very clear through their messaging that Stitt is running against Biden, that Joy is running against Stitt, and that Walters is running against Joy, right? Like it's like only one of them is running for the race in which they're actually in. And
So this is a
go ahead.
Well, this is a question I have, because I absolutely agree. And I mean, one of the notes I made is I think in there, they got like their 90-second opening statement. And Governor Stitt started, and I think he mentioned Joe Biden 6 times in that first 90 seconds. Like he was literally mentioning Joe Biden like every 15 seconds in his opening statement. Never called Hoffmeister by name. But Joe Biden, the Biden agenda, the Biden party, Biden. Do we think that's effective? Like, I mean, clearly they have some polling data that has convinced them more effective to run against Joe Biden than to run against Joy Hoffmeister. But like, do we think that works?
I mean, I saw a mailer for a state house seat today that was running against Biden, but it's for like an Oklahoma state house seat in Oklahoma City, and it was all about like Biden's a failure, tax and spend, blah blah blah. And it's like this person is running to beat him, and I was like, those are not related. I mean, the same thing that there's commercials or ads, something trying to tie Joy Hoffmeister to inflation, and it's like inflation is high on the entire globe, right? Inflation is like 10% in the UK. Joy Hoffmeister, as state superintendent of schools in Oklahoma, has zero to do with any of that.
But I
And
don't
so
think that's a unique practice, though,
No.
for this campaign to do that. I think that's textbook campaign of whenever there is a national leadership in office, especially when it's an opposing leadership, to disconnect yourself and point to that as, the bad thing. I mean, we see that from top down, even from, our congressional delegation constantly talking about here are the failures of, the White House or the Biden administration and blah, blah, blah. Right. And so that's to me a standard thing. But it's also not helpful or effective to mention and bring attention to your opponent, especially because people have more familiarity with the president than they do with the duties of a state superintendent, right? And so tying to that national voice and trying to keep your opponent's name from being recognized is a strategy that existed more so than I would say in recent time. Because if you look at some of the ads, I would say the negative ads that explicitly mention Joy Hoffmeister didn't start rolling until like the past few weeks, right?
Yeah.
So yes, especially over the past year when it came to campaign, it was, Biden did this, but, Governor Stitt took this position to stand up against Biden's XYZ. But you're seeing now in recent time, now that things are tightening up on at least mailers and commercials, the name recognition. And so I would suspect we'll start seeing more negative attacks over the next 2 weeks that aren't just Biden, especially after this debate. Because we'll see that whether or not, I guess I'll say whether or not many of the responses landed for the voters, because in the way that when I was watching it, because I went to the debate and I was sitting there live, it didn't feel like those mentions of Biden were effective or landed to the responses in the conversation about the debate.
I mean, that's my thing, right? Like, because I know that that's a strategy, and I understand where it comes from. I'm just curious if that works. One thing that I do wonder about, and I was curious about in the debate, and maybe Joy did it at some point and I just missed it. The way that I think you could, or a way, maybe not the way, a way that you can talk about that in kind of political terms is to say that the Stitt campaign is trying to nationalize the race, right? They're trying to nationalize the race, and usually you try to nationalize the race when talking about what's happening locally is not good for you. I was a little curious that Joy didn't confront that more directly. Like, I was waiting for her to say, like, "Hey, Governor, you've mentioned Joe Biden. I've been counting, Governor. You've mentioned Joe Biden 27 times tonight. I'm just curious. Do you think that Joe Biden's on the ballot in Oklahoma this fall? Joe Biden's not on the ballot. You're not running against Joe Biden. Why don't we quit talking about Joe Biden and talk about what you have done in Oklahoma?" I mean, maybe that's just, maybe I'm wrong, but to me, that could have been a very effective pushback.
Scott, I was watching some videos from the election night show, our event in 2018, and we made a joke about that. And I forget who it is now, but there was about the amount of conversation about someone's name who was not actually on the ballot. And so that is not a new trend for sure. I think Bailey's right about that. Well, friends and listeners, we are drawing near to our time today. Thank you, Scott and Bailey, for being with us here today.
Of course. Thank you, Andy.
Always a pleasure.
Listeners, thank you for being here as well. I hope that you were listening to this before Monday the 24th, because that evening we are hosting an event called Tacos and Text Banking. If you want to get involved and help us drive turnout this year, we're talking to voters. We're using text messaging to do it. It's surprisingly fun. And this time there'll be tacos and probably some beer and maybe a little music. I don't know. We can do a little cha-cha. We can dance. We can text. It'll be a lot of fun. So go to our website, letsfixthis.org, or go straight to our Mobilize page, mobilize.us/letsfixthis. I will also put those links in the show notes. Please sign up and join us. We'd love to have you. Great to meet you. Have some fun. Enjoy a taco. Help us talk to some voters. Beyond that, we will have some additional events coming up. And then the big, the Piece de Resistance, right, on election night, will be at Tower Theater in Oklahoma City for the election night show with special guests, Oklahoma City Mayor David Holt, AJ Griffin, Erica Lucas. We've got a band that is just a bunch of rock star musicians from here in Oklahoma City that are coming together to create a band. Guitars, horns, keyboards, drums, the whole thing. It's going to be a lot of fun. It'll be like The Tonight Show or The Late Show or whatever your late night talk show of choice. Think about that, but with friendly faces, talking about local issues that matter to you, some fun food, some funny jokes, some funny moments, all of that. That'll be on election night. Stay tuned for more details about that. And let's not forget that November 8th is Election Day. Listeners, you know it's coming. Please vote. You got to vote. You can vote by mail. You can vote early. You can vote on Election Day. Just make sure you vote. If you have questions about voting, where to go, how to do it, any of that stuff. If you've never voted before, but you listen to this podcast and you're nervous to say it, it's okay. Shoot us an email at podcast@letsfixthis.org. We are happy to not judge you and walk you through the process. You can ask, for your friend. Whatever you want to do is fine. We'll make sure it happens. All right, because remember that decisions are made by those who show up. Have a good week.